The dream that air power would become an independent and decisive force for victory in war began early and died hard. Early innovations in reconnaissance, attack, and air-to-air combat climaxed during the Second World War, when strategic bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific devastated cities, but were decisive only in combination with other elements of warfighting. By the end of the Cold War, precision munitions offered a renewal of the dream that casualty-free wars could be fought, at least for the victors. With unmanned aircraft, the militarization of space, and the new significance of competition in the cyber realm, what does the future of air power in war hold? Join us as we talk things through with the man who literally wrote the book on the subject.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of it soon.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
Hi, I'm Aaron McLean, and thanks for joining School of War. On today's episode, we're going to talk about air power. We're going to give a sort of very short introduction to the concept and its major themes, and who better to lead us through that than Frank Ledwidge, who's the Senior Fellow in Law and Strategy at the Royal Air Force College in Cranwell, England, and the author of Aerial Warfare, The Battle for the Skies, which is published by Oxford University Press and which appears in their very short introduction series. Very grateful to Frank for joining us. And sir, maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about yourself. You have extensive military experience, and maybe tell us as well about how you got interested in this subject matter and why you decided to write this book.
Well, thanks, Aaron. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a privilege. Anyhow, so I started my career as a trial lawyer. I did law at Oxford University, and I served or worked, I should say, for about 7 years as a trial lawyer. For most of that time, I was in the reserve forces, in the Navy, and I transited across from the sort of more maritime approach into the joint environment in the intelligence world. And when the Balkans came up, I got called up. Actually, I arranged myself to be called up, and spent about 7 years in the Balkans as a human intelligence officer initially, and then as a human rights officer for one of the international organizations. I then got called up in a military role into Iraq, relevantly spent also some time in Helmand in Afghanistan as a justice advisor for the British mission there. Did much the same role, justice and security officer for the British Embassy in Libya during the war there in 2011 and 2012, which, by the way, I was there on the centenary of the world's first airstrike, which was conducted by Italians on Turkish forces there in October 1911. After that, I took a post very happily as a lecturer at the Royal Air Force College, which is in Cranwell in Lincolnshire, essentially teaching aviation history, strategic practice and theory to our cadets there. Now, Cranwell's a little bit different from Colorado Springs. The course there is very short. It was 9 months. It's gone down now to 6. We needed to condense the history of air power so that the students or cadets could assimilate it pretty quickly. And I thought, well, it'd be a nice idea if we could bring that course together and indeed perhaps a bit more freely discuss things in a book. So I pitched this to OUP and accepted. I should also say I've written a couple of other books about British military failure in Iraq and Afghanistan for Yale, which came before this one. But I really took an interest in air power, as so many, I guess loads of listeners as well have, from when I was a little boy. You know, I always liked the aircraft and military history and tried to visit relevant places as much as I could and could identify all the Second World War aircraft. I suppose I'm in the generation where I knew a lot of the people who'd fought in the Second World War and was very excited to hear their accounts and carried that into my adult years, as I guess a lot of us have. So it was such fun to write this book.
Well, maybe we can come back around to the question of military failure towards the end of the episode. You and I are both veterans of Helmand Province. Why don't we start at the start and go back all the way to the First World War? You quote in your book the Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces, Foch, saying at the outset of the war, quote, "Aviation may be fine as a sport, but as an instrument of war, it is nothing." So what happened next?
Well, that's right. General, as he then wasn't, he became Foch, Marshal Foch, said, c'est rien. air power. And Kitchener and various other Allied leaders have been attributed to similar views, Haig and whatnot. We all know of the old trope about lions led by donkeys, and there's some truth to that, bull-headed, out-of-date generals and so forth. But very many of them weren't like that. And certainly Foch was one of those. Haig is arguable, although he has his partisans. But it's fair to say that Foch found out very, very, very quickly that air power was absolutely critical. Now, it had replaced cavalry as the key reconnaissance arm, not only for the infantry, but especially as the lines solidified on the Western Front into trench warfare, particularly for artillery, where 75% of the casualties were dished out from artillery. But very early in the campaign, the role of air power was absolutely central. There was the Battle of the Marne, famous incident where a French aircraft, which was flown by, I can't remember now his name, it's in the book anyway, the observer was a scion of a famous watchmaking family, which I'll think of. They observed a gap in the German lines, which French forces were able to exploit. And that saved Paris. I think it's fair to say that that particular observation saved the Western Front, because had Paris fallen, as it was very close to doing, that would have put an end to the war in the West. Not to the war in the East, which of course was equally brutal and large scale. But in that case, the Germans were under in the Eastern Front at roughly the same time. They were under heavy pressure from the Russians. And the Battle of Tannenberg, very similar thing happened. Air power, or air power in the form of a couple of rickety old aircraft, but essentially involving the reconnaissance role, observed the movements of Russian forces. And General Hindenburg there was able to use the information he received to strike appropriately and win the very famous Battle of Tannenberg, which stabilized the line and continued the war in the East for the Germans. So air power acted against the Germans in that respect in the West, but in the East was crucial to preserving their continued role as a force in being there in northeast Poland. So from the very start of the war, senior generals began to realize the potential of air power as a reconnaissance asset, and that solidified as the war went on.
And once you understand its power for reconnaissance, the thought then must quickly follow, well, gosh, we need to do something about the other guy's ability to reconnoiter us. And so what comes as a consequence of that?
Initially in 1914, early 1915, you had pilots and aircrew taking shots at each other. But it was realized, at least initially by the Germans, that the best gun platform was the aircraft itself. So you're going to see in a lot of First World aircraft, crews of two, you have a pilot and you have a gunner. And the gunner has a machine gun on a swivel. And that went on into the Second World War, at least until powered turrets were invented. But it was quickly realized by the Germans, particularly under the guidance of a Dutch engineer, Fokker, that the aircraft itself was the best gun platform. And that's where the fighter came from, in the form of the Fokker Eindecker, which in German means monoplane, which dominated the skies for the first year. And it had two advantages. First, as a stable gun platform. And secondly, and most importantly, there was something called an interrupter mechanism. Because if you're going to use the aircraft as a gun platform, a propeller aircraft, you have to find a mechanism whereby the guns can shoot through the propellers. Now, there were certain French fighter pilots who, particularly the French, who took the rather risky perspective that what we can do is we can fire our gun through the propellers, put some armor plate on the propellers to deflect bullets away, and hope for the best. One of the more famous pilots, in fact, the most famous pilot who adopted that particular technique, with some success actually, was Roland Garros. So those listeners who follow tennis will know Wimbledon and all the other tennis centres in Australia, US, etc. And of course, the one in France is called Roland Garros. It's named after that particular fighter pilot who managed not to shoot himself down, as many others did with that technique. Anyhow, the Fokker Eindecker had the interrupter mechanism, and it cut British and French reconnaissance advantage to pieces, really, for the first year or so of the war, until they themselves found out the mechanism, actually through some pretty good espionage and technical intelligence, and develop their own interrupter mechanisms. And that was the fighter. The role of the fighter, of course, is to control the air, or is to challenge for control of the air. Fighters themselves, and that's the case now and then, because one of the messages I want to put through in this book is that the roles of air power, and there are four, there's control of the air, which we're talking about now, there's attack, which we'll come to, there's reconnaissance, which we've already touched on, and then there's mobility. Now, all of these roles essentially have remained the same from the early days of 1914 right through today, and will remain the same all the way into space, frankly.
So you talked us through how the reconnaissance function leads to the need to achieve air superiority. How does how does bombing come about in the First World War?
Yeah, it was found pretty early on that the strafing of trenches, which essentially means being attacked by machine guns from above, had limited effect. But the application of explosives from the air could achieve some effect. The key example of that was the bombing of London in 1917 by aircraft. And there'd been Zeppelins doing it. The campaign against London and other cities was actually extremely effective. It killed about 700 people and injured hundreds or thousands more, including many children. And the political effect of that bombing of cities was truly strategic, in that it prompted the British to develop a system, and it's systems, again, that run through this book. So you have the roles and you have air defense systems, and indeed attack systems. And they came from the attack on London, particularly. And the system stopped the attacks. It's called the London Area Defence Zone then. And the attacks themselves forced the foundation of a dedicated air force, the Royal Air Force, the world's first dedicated air arm, separate from the other services. So that attack role at the strategic level, which you and I might take to mean essentially attacking an enemy's cities or key assets, the fundamentals were there in the First World War. I could talk at great length about how successful they were. Aside from that, they weren't really very effective materially, but they were effective to the extent that the impression they gave is that cities were no longer, particularly in Britain, and very well defended places such as that, were no longer immune from warfare.
And of course, that'll come to be brutally illustrated with the events of the Second World War. But let's talk a bit about the interwar period and about the prophets, as they are often called, of air power. Talk us through the most important of them, the theorists and authors of doctrine in that period, what they predicted, and then we'll talk about what actually happens in Spain and then the whole world in the 40s.
There are three major prophets or seers of air warfare, and they looked at the experience of the First World War. The most important of them, I think, remains Douhet, who was an Italian general. So we have Douhet at first, and Douhet comes up with two ideas. Now, all of these had been seen in the First World War, but the best way to gain control of the air, to gain command of the air, and he called his book that, Command of the Air in Italian, is to destroy your enemy's air bases. Simple as that. And you can exercise that control of the air then freely, and this is the second idea, and make air forces and armies and navies irrelevant, and attack their cities and force your enemy into submission that way through terror. And he advocated the use of firebombing, gas, and every weapon that could be brought to bear. Now, inhuman though it was, and Douhet conceded that, he said it's far better than trench warfare or the appalling mayhem that he'd seen on the Italian front, Caporetto and elsewhere, and of course on the Western front. So he said, look, that's the most humane way to conduct warfare, and air power offers us that opportunity. So we gain command of the air, we destroy an enemy's air force so he can't do the same to us, and then we use our command of the air to destroy their population centres. Mitchell, Brigadier General Mitchell, also had two central ideas. The first was that navies are no longer, or should no longer be going concerns as massive sinks of investment. The battleship is finished, and he famously demonstrated that by using his aircraft to sink an old German ship that the Americans had got hold of as part of the war reparations called the Ostfriesland. And he sunk it with 20 or so aircraft. By the way, the whole thing was a setup. He'd arranged a particular rules with the admirals, that there'd be one wave of bombing and then they'd check damage, and there'd be another and they'd check more damage. And what the admirals actually saw was bomb after bomb after bomb fall near this battleship. They weren't allowed to go near it until it sank. So they were.
I don't think much has changed about the defense industry and the Pentagon to this day.
No, but they got their own back on him eventually. In 1925, he was cashiered for insubordination. And the final prophet or seer is a guy called Trenchard. Now, Trenchard is known even today as, any day, as the father of the Royal Air Force. His approach, which is like much else of what Trenchard did, was based on some very clever ex post facto rationalization of things that really didn't happen in the First World War, but he said they did. But his idea was that the effect of morale on an enemy population is 20 times greater than material damage. That's partly convenient reasoning on his part, because the damage that the Royal Air Force had dished out to German cities in the First World War was very minimal, but the idea was that the morale damage was far greater, which it wasn't, but that's the argument placed. Now, that played very, very much into the way the Royal Air Force dealt with with its bombing campaign in the Second World War, something called morale bombing. So you have these three seers: one, terror, gain command of the air, destroy enemies' air bases. Two, that's Duet. Two, Mitchell. Navies are no longer relevant. We can jump over them with air forces. That's a sort of collateral to his main idea, which is that we use air power to destroy an enemy's capability to fight, factories, networks, and so forth. And Trenchard, we attack an enemy's will to fight.
In some ways, and I'm curious if you agree with this, it seems like that period's parallel today is with respect to cyber warfare.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair comparison, Aaron. I think I'm just given to think about the way that some cyber attackers are looking at strategy now. You know, do you, if you attack an enemy, let's say you take out the water supply of the city I live near here in England, Oxford. So, you threaten to do so. Now, what are you attacking there? You're attacking the capability of the population. Yeah, of course you are. But essentially, what you're attacking is that you're creating an atmosphere of fear, playing into the way that those people will look at the possibility of conflict. And that goes right back into the idea both of terror bombing from Duet and of attacking an enemy's will to fight, as per Trenchard. Now, of course, they weren't the first people to come across these ideas. You know, we have Genghis Khan was a great practitioner of terror as a form of warfare, and many other generals as well. But to apply it to new technology was their innovation. And of course, we're at a very early stage in cyber and space now. We're at the same stage in space warfare as we were in air warfare in the 1920s. Yeah. Really, this new thinking is coming out all the time.
To take it up to the war, then let's talk about these famous figures of the war. You have Bomber Harris leading the British Strategic Air Campaign. You have Curtis LeMay in the 8th Air Force. Talk about how these theorists, and in particular these ideas of terror bombing and targeting the will to fight on the one hand, and industrial targeting or going after means of production on the other hand, influence the British and American ways of war.
They were all, Harris and LeMay particularly, and Goering and the other German commanders, they were, as most military commanders are, extremely ruthless people, and they had to be. But they weren't inhuman, and they were considered individuals, and they were looking at ways of ending the war with minimal cost, especially to their own side. Now, the Bomber Harris is an extremely divisive figure. Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, very divisive figure still, but someone who, and his air crews called him Butch, for Butcher, but it was an affectionate nickname and an ironic one, because he was willing to take huge casualties for what he did, but they loved him for his uncompromising approach. Now, Harris is credited with the idea of morale bombing. The reason that the British were forced to firebomb German cities was essentially because that's the only thing they could do with the kit they had. They tried what the Germans did in the Battle of Britain. They tried daylight attacks on military targets, only to find that, like the Germans, they were shot out of the sky at a very high rate, an unsustainable rate. So they defaulted, like the Germans did, to night bombing, and they did so for 3 or 4 years. But what the British did was develop technologies or built technology on top of the technology that already developed, and the investment they'd made in their bombing force, which began before the war. And they built on that to form a force which was capable in one night, in favourable for them conditions, of annihilating a city through firestorms. The first time they did that was in 1943 in I think it's 43 in Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, where 40,000 people were killed. It's probably the bloodiest day in Western Europe's history, certainly since the 30 Years' War. By the way, Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, reported that in his view, 5 more of those would have ended the war. And of course, Harris was quite keen to do as many as he could of those, but could never achieve the same effect prior to Dresden later in the war.
And what were the conditions? Sorry, just to go into that for a second. What did he need that he was unable to replicate to achieve that?
He needed good weather, good location. Hamburg's easy to find, it's on the coast, and therefore the technologies could locate it. So all the bombers found their targets, which they, by that time anyway, didn't always do. It had been a dry season. You had a city that at that time was very beautiful. Beautiful, not in or there, but it was a Hansa city. It was made essentially in wood, and the British were able to exploit all those conditions to put together. And I think there's a fair argument to say it was deliberate. What's called a firestorm, where the bombing and the attendant fires created essentially its own weather system, which blew hurricanes of flame and fire through the city when essentially no one could survive. And it was achieved again in Pforzheim, February 1945, and later that month in Dresden again, and 1 or 2 other occasions. And in situations like that, you get tens of thousands and not just thousands of casualties. And that's exactly what happened in Hamburg. The city was essentially destroyed, which is why you go there now, and you're going to see very, very little of the old Hamburg left.
And just to illustrate this, I'll say I was recently in Mainz on the Rhine, which, as you know, was the target of any number of raids, both by the Americans and the Brits. And there was one particularly bloody one, I believe, in February of 1945, where a couple of thousand people were killed. I took a tour of their air raid tunnels. It's the old city fortress. Has these, tunnels that were built underground in, I think, the 18th century as tunnels to be used by sappers to build up besieging to blow up besieging forces from underground. And they used those tunnels in the 40s to protect the civilian population, or at least those members of the civilian population who qualified, according to the Nazi Party, to get into the shelters from the bombing. And the worst night was, a successful raid from the British point of view, but from the German point of view, what they did was they accidentally let everyone out of the tunnels too early. And so they got caught in the bombing. Actually, what happened every other night was people stayed in the tunnels and there was substantial property damage. For the most part, the death count was much lower than what I think the Brits would have hoped for. And that seems to frequently have been the outcome of these raids.
Oh yeah, that's right. If you look at the records of Bomber Command, you'll see that most raids resulted in 400 or 500 deaths and several thousand injuries. But it's a cumulative effect as well, Aaron. And by the way, those later war raids, and the most famous of which was Dresden, for which the British get nailed, but by the way, the Americans were heavily involved in it as well. You get Pforzheim, you get Mainz, and dozens of others actually, after it was clear that the main purpose of city bombing had completely changed. And now what was happening, that this is the really controversial piece. So before D-Day, I suppose putting it very simplistically, but before D-Day, Harris had an argument that morale bombing could work. Let's call it morale bombing for want of a better term. It was separating German industry from its suppliers. It was shattering their economy to some extent. It was taking up huge numbers of guns, of personnel, of damage control, people's civil defense, which we often forget. And by the way, concerning the air campaign, those who oppose it today and say, well, we killed 440,000 Germans for what? And the answer is that 65% of the German fighter force and a similar proportion of artillery tubes were pointed into the sky rather than Russian or British or American tanks.
Right.
Plus 2 million other personnel could be used for other things, in addition to the vast amounts of damage that the Germans sustained in both the American and British campaigns. The British bombed at night, the Americans in the day. The Americans, just to move on to them, did try their Mitchell theory on the Germans, which was to attack the Germans' industrial network. And the trouble was with precision bombing. The trouble was that precision in Arizona didn't translate across to precision in Europe, especially when their formations were being cut to pieces by German fighters. Eventually, they got the edge on the Germans with the deployment of long-range fighters, namely the P-38s and especially P-51 Mustangs powered by the British Merlin engine. By the end of the war, the point is, or the last year, British and American bombers were ranging over Germany, uninterfered with by German Air Force. But here's the thing, Aaron, here's one of the other key things that runs through the book, is that, and this goes back to do it in a sense, you can't necessarily get command of the air just by destroying your enemy's air force, because the enemy has a say in the form of its ground-based air defense systems. About 50% of British and American bombers were shot down by flak, but that's to say by guns. And towards the end of the war, percentage was much, much higher because the German Air Force was no longer a going concern. What the American Air Force did in 1944 was essentially destroy the Luftwaffe as a going concern with their long-range fighters, and a combination of that and their industrial network theory being applied to the German aero industry, attacking the engine factories, attacking the fuel, especially the fuel, so that the German aircrew didn't have time to train, to replace their pilots, to replace their fighters, to challenge the excellently trained American fighters with unlimited fuel. And effectively, over a period of 6 months or so, the German Luftwaffe was utterly destroyed by American air power, a combination of its brilliant fighters and its very well applied bombing campaign. The British, slightly different approach.
Fair to say then that the role of air power in the war was vastly significant. Do you think it's the case that the vision of the prophets for its primacy is totally fulfilled, partially fulfilled, not fulfilled at all in the war?
I think it's fair to say that this idea of attacking an enemy's will to fight did not work in Germany. There's very little evidence of that. The reports after the war indicated that, if anything, German resolve was strengthened by massive losses of civilians. But I think one thing that was vindicated was in the Second World War was Mitchell's ideas of what's called it was actually the Air Corps Tactical School, which was a child essentially of Mitchell, still exists actually in Maxwell Air Base in another form. But their ideas, which they developed through the 30s, the bomber mafia, as they were called, of destroying an enemy's ability to fight through attacking key nodes, in principle, worked. And we see that amply evidenced in the later part of the war, particularly in the campaign called Operation Point Blank, which was just before D-Day, where the idea was to separate the German forces in northern France from any supplies or fuel coming their way, or reinforcements from the south of France and Germany itself, which worked brilliantly. And that was contingent, of course, upon annihilating the Air Force and allowing them to range much more freely than they otherwise could have done. So I think Mitchell was vindicated. We'll come to Douay when we come on to the Arab-Israeli wars, where we see his ideas really coming to the fore, particularly of gaining command of the air. Trenchard, less so. But it's also worth saying this. We talk about these prophets, and air power theorists talk about this perhaps a little too much. Harris, at a meeting which I actually heard or read the transcript, this is in the 70s, he was asked, did you take any account of Douet in your planning of the bombing campaign? And he said, never heard of him, never had any, didn't need to.
Just to take us through the Cold War for a second, I have successfully indoctrinated my 3-year-old into being an enormous Chuck Yeager fan. And of course, he recently passed away. And one of my favorite sayings of Yeager, who was full of them, was the first time I saw a jet, I shot it down. After the war, we had these enormously significant technological developments. What are the big trends of the Cold War as far as the development of air power is concerned?
The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is development of the jet, which makes things a lot quicker and actually far more efficient. And, we see that first of all in the Korean War. It's not a forgotten war, but certainly its air power elements and the length, the long shadow of what it did has been forgotten. The US essentially destroyed North Korea as an advanced state insofar as it was, and it certainly as advanced as South Korea at the time, and killed somewhere far north of 1 million people. And that legacy subsists today. There are perennials in air warfare which essentially center around the roles and the relative supremacy of roles. You go through periods where attack is the key element. So you have that in Vietnam. You go through periods where control of the air and the prevention of attack is in vogue, and you get that in the 70s and the 80s, I'd suggest. And now we're into, I think we're into a period where ISTAR, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance. That's the key role where perhaps much of it, if not most, resources go. If you absent the F-35, of course. So you get these ebbs and flows of roles and emphases, and those are often based on personality. So in the US, you have the bomber mafia, which subsisted in the form of Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command into the 60s. You then had the sort of fighter boys, then sort of didn't quite dominate in the 70s, and so on. And today, I think we've got a far more nuanced air power leadership. But so that's all I'd say to that.
There's one moment, a post-Cold War moment, I'd like to zoom in on before we talk about the present day a bit more, and that's Kosovo in 1999. This was a moment where, in certain respects, just to not to beat the dead horse, but to go back to the prophets, in certain respects, it seemed as though air power had finally fulfilled its promise of achieving decisive strategic results. Against a significant adversary, not a negligible adversary, not, terrorists in the desert or something like that, but an actual state with state objectives. Does that hold up as a judgment in retrospect?
In retrospect, it was a confused campaign, Matt, because the initial phase of it involved the attempt to locate and destroy Serbian ground forces who were at the time conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it's very difficult to strike effectively small groups of people who are murdering civilians, and they were not struck effectively. So then focus moved to infrastructure, and then to the capital, with some mixed success, especially when the Chinese embassy managed to get bombed by mistake. It was a genuine mistake. It was quite a major error.
Yeah.
And it was only when Belgrade was attacked that the Serbian leadership, which was really the key element here, felt threatened enough to go to the table. Milosevic did not care about how many thousands or hundreds of Serb soldiers were killed. In fact, the more the better from his perspective. But it's when his personal interests were being affected politically, and there was a chance that that other interests might decide to take an interest in his continuing as a leader. It was only when that happened that Milosevic went to the negotiating table, went to the Russians actually to effect that. So it was a confused campaign, but I'd say it has has a huge legacy. The Balkan campaign, and to I think a lesser extent the various Iraq wars, and that's that Russia and China saw that there was little point in taking on the West in the air. They were just going to get shot down. Their kit wasn't good enough. Their doctrine wasn't good enough. Their training was nothing like NATO or American standards, as far as you can draw a distinction. So they thought, well, how can we offset that? And the result we have now is that both Russia and China have adopted strategies very firmly based around absolutely superb air defense systems, ground-based air defense systems. And by the way, you had something similar happen in the late 60s, early 70s in Egypt, where the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed on the ground, as per Douai in 1967. And Egyptians and Russians got together and thought, well, look, we can't take on the Israelis in the air, so let's take them on from the ground. And they did so very effectively with ground-based air defense systems, which eventually the Israelis found a way around that in the 80s. And so we're going to have to find a way around the Russian and Chinese offset of what we call anti-access area denial, which is a child, I think, of the Balkan campaigns. It's a bastard child of the Balkan campaigns, and to a lesser extent Iraq. And indeed, the only damage that the Serbs did to NATO, they shot down 2 US aircraft, including a stealth fighter, from the ground using very innovative ground-based air defense systems, extremely well-trained people.
Other point I would make just about what you just said, it's something someone recently pointed out to me that the mistaken bombing of the Chinese embassy in 1999 lives on in Chinese culture and thought in a way that is way out of proportion to the extent that it lives on in the United States. Yeah, in the United States, we sort of moved past it. We apologized, but I think most importantly, there's no reasonable American who thinks that we did it on purpose, right? It was sort of an idea that's dismissed out of hand. It was an obvious mistake, a terrible mistake, a mistake that shouldn't have happened, but a mistake. And that is not apparently the case in Chinese sort of discussion of the incident to this day. And it has a significant role in their thinking and in popular attitudes towards the United States, that this couldn't possibly have been accidental, given the power of American air power, given its precision, given our intelligence capabilities. There's just no way. Now, the fact that it doesn't seem to make any strategic sense doesn't appear to matter very much.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Perceptions. I mean, when I think I was in Helmand probably before you, so I was there 7, 8. I remember being told then that the common perception amongst Helmandis was that the British were deliberately failing to deliver on their promises to provide development and construction and all that lovely stuff as revenge for the Battle of Maiwand, which took place in 1880. The Afghans defeated roundly, straight up defeated us. But the perception was that our failure to deliver on our promises was absolutely deliberate. And the rationale was, well, look, we see all these helicopters flying around, all these troops in their body armor, all this expensive kit, and everybody cruising around in big cars and tanks and armored vehicles and what have you. And people like that can't possibly be unable to build a few schools for us or some roads like the Russians did. Therefore, it must be deliberate.
Well, that speaks to the in some ways to our theme. I was there in 9 and 10, and it's fair to say that we were tactically very successful. Anytime there was a fight, and air power played some role in that. Operationally, we did fine, though there's a case to be made that in certain respects we were frequently stalemated. And then strategically, I mean, in the long run of the war, there's no way to argue it was a success. It was a dramatic failure in the end. And 5 times the amount of air power capability couldn't have changed that. It seems to me. I'm curious to know your take on air power in modern warfare, especially the kind we've been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, you're right about the relevance of air power. Of course, the predominant. Well, there were two roles there, weren't there? There was the ISTAR role and the mobility role. Same for all counterinsurgency campaigns. Both ISTAR and mobility are predominant, and that goes right back into to the early days of the 20s. Same thing, reconnaissance, mobility. I mean, I come back to this business of air dominance. I'm not. Obviously, it's the case that the Taliban or the Asli Taliban or whichever group it was that they were fighting, whatever given time, were afraid of air power, but it never offset the strategic advantage they had of a coherent narrative, incapable though they were of realistically challenging that air power. Same applies, of course, in Vietnam or in any insurgency you care to take into account. Of course, in Vietnam, the Viet Cong could challenge, and they shot down thousands of American aircraft, one kind or another, from the ground. But that speaks to me to Clausewitz, ultimately. If you have a political narrative, a strategic narrative that's coherent and generally accepted, then you're likely to prevail over your opponent who does not. However many helicopters and F-15s or tornadoes he's got.
You mentioned space warfare earlier in our conversation. Is it, as a kind of warfare, a natural extension of aerial warfare? Does the same sort of logic apply in a kind of linear fashion, or are there new considerations that are different in kind when it comes to space?
This is a huge debate now, and theorists of space. I teach space power for the Air Force, and theorists of space power now tend to look at things more from a naval angle. So they look at space control as an analogy to sea control, to the wide oceans of low orbit space. But I think when you get out into cislunar space and indeed lunar space, which we will be getting to far quicker, I think, than most people think, and that's where air power analogies, I think, start to strike again. because you have to defend mobile assets in dynamic space, huge, vast three-dimensional spaces. You have the idea, I think, which currently isn't very present in space power enthusiasts, of mobility. We're beginning to see Space Force look at that now, but only beginning as SpaceX starts to operationalize its Starship, which I think will be a massive step change in space capabilities, which NASA are not ready for, nor Space Force yet, as far as I know. So I think there are analogies to both sea power and air power, but in fairness to the space people, I think they have their own domain and they can learn from both, and indeed Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and others, but they're going to have to develop their own ideas. I mean, just because of the unforgiving volume of space.
Frank Ledwidge, author of Aerial Warfare. We've covered a great deal of ground or space, and it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm really very, very grateful to you, and maybe we can have you back sometime to go into more detail on any of the dozens of topics that we've covered that probably merit their own episodes.
Oh, Aaron, it's been great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
This is a Nebulous Media production. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.